Good evening. This is Politics and Bourbon, Sunday Commentary Edition. This is where we go through the commentary and news articles in the Sunday legacy media, the New York Times and the New York Post, and find out which of the stories are bullshit and which of the stories actually have some merit. So we're going to start with the New York Post. The New York Post had an article in the opinion pages today. Soulless censors, zombie-like polls, and officials want to eat your brain and destroy free speech. It's a clickbait title, but the New York Post is kind of known for that. Vice President J.D. Vance denounced European politicians for blighting democracy with brazen censorship in a February speech in Munich. Vance warned, if you're running in fear of your own voters, there is nothing America can do for you. This is true, unfortunately. Free speech is dying in Europe. Multiculturalism is in. Trigger words and trigger phrases are in Europe and the UK, and people are being arrested for essentially free speech. Because you have to remember, America is one of the few countries on earth that guarantees free speech. There's no real guarantee written in solid stone in most other Western countries. There are laws that make for free speech, but there's no constitutionally guaranteed free speech many other places in the world besides America. But because America had free speech, most of the Western world has had free speech for a few hundred years. I mean, even back in the Victorian days, you could criticize Queen Victoria in the papers, and no harm would come to you. Unfortunately, that is changing. According to the New York Post, a slew of zombie-like politicians and zealots remains hell-bent on destroying free speech in Europe and America. The funny thing is that the two leaders of this charge, one is the UK, that's unfortunate, as they should be leading with the US on free speech, but the other one, unfortunately, is Germany, a country that should know better than to curtail free speech. This is a country that invented book burning, that brought us a lot of bad stuff. As a matter of fact, I have a history professor friend who has the odd claim that nearly everything bad in history for the last 150 years can be blamed on Germany if you stretch your logic far enough. You've got the deaths in the Holocaust, 12 million. You've got the deaths in World War II, over 50 million. The deaths in World War I in the tens of millions. And, of course, communism, which is deaths in the hundreds of millions because Karl Marx was, of course, German. So Germany really, after giving the world all of that, certainly should not be limiting free speech. As the New York Post puts, Germany was the scene of some of the 20th century's worst tyranny, but today's German leaders claim notable intentions for oppression. German police routinely raid homes, confiscate electronic devices, interrogate suspects, and prosecute individuals for the exercise of freedom of speech, including online. According to the U.S. State Department Human Rights Report, which is about as official as it gets, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who's the German Chancellor, has personally filed almost 5,000 complaints against online critics, sometimes resulting in police raids against the people he targeted. That's a little shocking, you know. You've got the Chancellor of Germany essentially informing on 5,000 of his citizens. Britain is unfortunately not much better. Our oldest and most dependable ally has unfortunately lost its way somewhat in the last few years. Forbes, again about as official as it comes, reported British police are making more than 30 arrests a day over what they deem to be offensive online posts, retweets, and cartoons. That's 12,000 arrests a year. The government even punishes individuals guilty of, and here's where the big problem is, cultural nationalism. Now, there was an article a few weeks ago about a person who went to jail for flying the Union Jack, and that proved to be not entirely true or taken out of context. But the fact is that if you show in Britain an overt display of nationalism, you are likely to get yourself on a watch list. And that overt display of nationalism may just be flying the St. George's flag outside your house along with the Union Jack. Cultural nationalism, according to the British and the New York Post, is defined as a belief that Western culture is under threat from mass migration into Europe. This is actually true. I've often said that America is very, very lucky with our illegal immigration problems. You know, luckily Trump has controlled them. Immigration, there's no more catch and release, and illegal border crossings are down to their lowest point in 40 years, to the point where it's actually now handleable within the resources of the Border Patrol. And that's all to the Trump administration's credit. Under Biden, we had millions of people a year coming in illegally, and we lost track of most of them because they were catch and release. But we are very fortunate in America. About 90+% of the illegals that crossed our border were from Central and South America, were from this hemisphere. And due to many historical problems and issues, and some good, some bad, over the last 200 years, including colonization, the Western Hemisphere is almost universally Christian, either Catholic or Christian, so Catholic or Protestant, and almost all of Central and Latin and South America do share a common Christian identity and also a common, how should I put this lightly? They already have Western values. They already have perhaps not American values until the second or third generation, but they have Western values. The values of individualism, liberty, all of that. Europe, on the other hand, most of their mass migration comes from the Middle East and North Africa, which is mostly Muslim, which is not the same as Europe. And the problem is that they get to Europe, and Europe is not a melting pot. America very, very easily absorbs other cultures. It's why we have pizza. It's why we have Irish food. It's why we have Irish pubs. It's why we have every kind of food you can imagine, including some foreign foods that have become now known as American foods, like pizza. But in Europe, though, they're not a melting pot. This is a continent that was almost universally Catholic or Protestant and white for basically 2,000 years up until about 20 years ago. And now the huge influx of immigrants doesn't matter what color skin they are different religiously, different culturally, and have different social mores and values than Europe has. And because Europe has no history of being a melting pot, assimilation takes exponentially longer than it does assimilating a foreign culture. That 10% that came illegally into America that were from countries that weren't Christian and didn't have Western values, they assimilate in 1 or 2 generations. The Europeans don't have that melting pot, which means assimilation takes 4 or 5 or even 6 generations. That's over 100 years to assimilate. And so it's really important to remember that America, as much as our immigration problems are bad, we certainly have it, even in our worst days under Biden, we had it better than Europe. Ursula von der Leyen, European Commission President, is championing a European democracy shield to provide endless pretexts to suppress ideas, people, and political parties that they disapprove of. The Trump administration has rightfully condemned the European Union's digital service tax as an authoritarian tool to give Euro bureaucrats veto power over the entire internet. The EU last month hit Elon Musk's X with a $140 million fine for alleged violations of that act. Now, luckily, Elon Musk is a huge champion of free speech, and $140 million to him is essentially a rounding error. So I don't think he really lost much sleep over it. But you have to remember, the Europeans, all of this bureaucracy, all of this control. Do you ever wonder why there's not a whole lot of trillion-dollar companies that are based in Europe, but there are a bunch that are based in the U.S.? There's no Elon Musk of Europe. There's no Jeff Bezos of Europe. There's no Microsoft of Europe or Google of Europe. And the reason is because Europe simply is not a place where creativity thrives. It's a place where creativity goes to die. People who want to do stuff that is creative and world-changing, they want to break stuff and make it better, that are Europeans, they come to America to do it because they know that their own countries won't support them. Going on in the article, Americans must never forget how not long ago federal agencies secretly sabotaged the First Amendment. Federal Judge Terry Doherty condemned the Biden censorship regime in 2023 as potentially the most massive attack against free speech in United States history. Federal censorship tainted the 2020 and 2022 elections, suppressing tens of millions of tweets, YouTube videos, and Facebook posts from conservatives. Twitter, there's a quote, Twitter was basically an FBI subsidiary before Elon Musk took it over. And we can thank God for Elon Musk. I'm not usually a fan of people worth hundreds of billions of dollars. I respect them, but I'm not always their biggest fan or champion. But Elon Musk taking over X did give us free speech back on a platform that had fallen well under DC bureaucratic control. The article goes on to say censorship defines down self-government to one person, one vote, one time. Whoever wins a national election will exploit the censorship regime to precipitate their own power. German politicians are conniving to outlaw the second largest political party, the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, because officialdom despises its beliefs. But it wasn't AfD that caused Germans' trust in government to plummet in recent years. Censorship is turning democracy into a parody. Voters choose politicians who can dictate what citizens are permitted to read, think, and say. As censorship multiplies, vote counts merely gauge prevailing delusions among the populace and turn self-government into a charade. This is true. Alternative for Deutschland. I don't agree with about 60% of what they stand for. They are a group, but they do have some logic behind them. They are the only party in Germany that is saying that this whole idea of inviting in 5 million Muslims that will take 5 or 6 generations to assimilate was probably not a good idea of the former Chancellor, Angela Merkel. And that is important. That is important. I remember visiting Germany as a child, and then as a teenager, and then because we had family friends in Germany. As a child, as a teenager, I remember skiing in Germany, down in Bavaria, and I remember any city in Germany back in the 1990s, 1980s. You could walk the streets at 3 o'clock in the morning with 100 Deutschmark note taped to your lapel, pinned to your lapel. Never have to worry about anything. The streets were safe. Women were safe. And that's not the case anymore. Amount of rapes, assaults, and just in general cultural insensitivity. I can remember 2 Oktoberfest. I had a dear friend in Munich saying that the Muslims were protesting because of the pork sausage at Oktoberfest. These are Muslims that were granted refugee status in Germany, that Germany took in. And yet they're taking a national holiday and complaining about the fact that pork sausage is being cooked. Well, no one's going to make them eat the damn sausage, so I would say that they should just shut up and mind their own goddamn business. Vice President Vance promised that the Trump administration will do precisely the opposite of the Biden-esque and Europe-style censorship. Fulfilling that lofty standard would be a great way to honor the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I have to say, the New York Post very well said. If America loses our free speech, then it dies in the world, because we are the shining city on a hill when it comes to free speech that everybody looks to. And if we get rid of free speech, even if it's speech that we hate, I hate to say it, but hate speech is free speech. It's the reason why the Supreme Court allowed people as disgusting as the KKK and the American Nazi Party to have marches. Hate speech is still free speech. The only law says that you can't shout fire in a movie theater. You can't cause a panic with your speech purposefully. But beyond that, everything else is allowed and always has been in America. And if we lose that, then the world loses the greatest beacon of free speech that has ever existed, which is the United States, because the founders thought to enshrine that not just in the Constitution, but as the First Amendment of the Constitution. They knew that that's something they wanted America to always have, and it would be a damn shame if some soulless, zombie-like poll censors got rid of it, which is what the New York Post calls them. That's not me. Moving on in the same New York Post, under the chatter section in the editorials, Treasury Secretary Scott Bennett made the argument that Trump's economic policies will spur growth next year. 2025 is setting the table. The feast and the banquet will be in 2026. This is probably not far from the truth. Unless something major happens, 2026 will be an absolutely explosive growth year for the U.S. in terms of salaries, wages, and business growth. 4.2% economic growth in the last quarter. We're looking at 3% growth for the year. That would be an excellent year no matter what. By any metric, 3% growth is excellent. It's a growth rate that we haven't seen on a regular basis since the mid-90s. And with the tax cuts coming, retroactively with this year's 2026's tax returns, and with those tax cuts moving forward, people will see more in their paychecks. They'll go out and spend more. And the animal spirits are very, very important in this respect. It's something Obama never understood. Obama never really had any policies that were anti-industry or anti. He wasn't like Biden's term, where you ended up with extremely. That would be a nice way to put this. Extremely petulant and control-driven bureaucrats trying to control everything in business. The EPA was essentially unleashed to do the most economic damage it could possibly do in as short amount of time as it could possibly do under Biden. And it made some absolutely stupid decisions. But no. You're going to look at 3% growth for 2025, and we could even make 3.5, 3.8% growth for 2026, which last time that we saw that on a regular basis was Reagan in the mid-'80s after his tax cuts. We probably won't get above 4%, but if you can average 3+% for your presidency, you've had a damn good presidency, historically speaking. Moving on in the commentaries, death to the dictator. Iran protesters chant against Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So there are protests going on in Iran right now because their inflation has soared about 200% in the last 12 months, to the point where it's well over $1 million of the local currency to get one US dollar. Generally speaking, when your currency has to have 6 zeros behind it to equal one US dollar, you're not doing too well. I would say that I have friends in Israel, and including in the Israeli Knesset, and they're very keen on the Shah's son retaking Iran. And to be honest, there's a lot of nostalgia in Iran, not just in the Iranian diaspora around the world that fled when the original Shah fell in 79. But there is a nostalgia within Iran for the Shah to be back in power, perhaps not as a absolute monarch, but as a constitutional monarch. Or head of government, and that would be absolutely fantastic. Israel is right on that. The Iranians had a great relationship with Israel up until the Shah fell in 79. They had a great relationship with the West. One of the few Middle Eastern countries that the U.S. government was prepared to sell its highest tech military equipment to. It's why the Iranian military, up until the Israeli airstrikes, was still flying the F-14 Tomcat. We sold over 90 copies to the Shah of that plane, which was, at the time, a plane like the F-22 is today that we typically didn't export because it was so high-tech. And to be honest, I'm a little bit upset because the Israelis were flying F-35s, and I would have loved to have seen, the Israelis got all the F-14s while they were on the ground. It would have been really kind of cool to see an F-35 take on an F-14 Tomcat in a dogfight and have someone put the soundtrack to Top Gun behind it. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and that will never happen anymore because Iran had the last still functional and flying military F-14s because they had been cannibalizing and keeping them essentially as zombie planes. But it would have still been cool. So the next section in commentary is called Socialist Rise. Comments from the current mayor of New York, Mayor Mamdani, at his inauguration. We will replace the frigidity of rugged individualism with the warmth of collectivism. Someone might want to get him a book on what happened with collectivism in almost every country that tried it. It didn't end well. Not in China, not in Russia. In China, it caused the worst famine Asia's ever seen and killed over 60 million people. In Russia, the Ukrainian Holodomor and other famines, when they tried to collectivize stuff, killed somewhere between 30 and 50 million. Collectivism doesn't work. It has never worked. And it's not socialist, it's communist. Collectivism is communist. It's not even socialist. And I will say that maybe he should also read the Gulag Archipelago, because typically speaking, once you introduce collectivism, you end up having to put those who disagree with you into gulags. And I'm not quite sure anybody wants that. So maybe he's got a couple of books to read. The Road to Serfdom by Hayek and the Gulag Archipelago would be two good books for Mayor Mamdani to read, because he seems to be taking Das Kapital in 1984 and Animal Farm as how-to guides rather than warnings. You also have a quote from Gustavo Gordillo, NYC Democrat Socialists of America co-chair. Zoran's agenda needs fighters in Albany, and that's why we're running a socialist slate for the state legislature. That's just what New York needs, more socialism, because it's worked so well for them so far. The next section is World Turning. Share of Americans by age who say it's important for the United States to take an active role in foreign affairs. It's actually quite an interesting study. 73% of those 65 and older say the United States should essentially remain the world policeman. 59% of 50 to 64-year-olds, 44% of 30 to 49-year-olds, but only 39% of 18 to 29-year-olds. You know, the fact is that America, up until the end of World War II, was by nature a fairly isolationist country. Not in terms of keeping ourselves to ourselves in terms of just America, but in terms of keeping to the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, where we did what we needed to and to keep the Western Hemisphere on side, and we didn't bother with what happened on the other side of the Pacific or the Atlantic unless it directly affected us. And that was basically our way of thinking up until the end of World War II, when we created what became the post-war order. I would argue that America's natural state is isolationist, and there's a huge isolationist, America First, whether they like to call themselves that or not. Democrats will never call themselves America First, but a lot of their ideas are very America First ideas. So I do believe that you have a generation that's coming up that is quickly going to make isolationism, or at least keeping to the Western Hemisphere, American policy again, where America keeps to the Western Hemisphere unless something on one side of the ocean or the other is directly affecting U.S. interests. And to be fair, it's not the worst thing in the world, but unfortunately it does mean the world loses its world policeman. And there's not a country currently that can fill that void. It was the British before us, so it was the British up until the end of World War II. But there's no country that can fulfill that. China might be able to fulfill it from a monetary and material perspective as well as from a military perspective, but China has also been the Middle Kingdom for thousands of years. It is not a big believer in being the world policeman. It has no want to be the world policeman, and there's no other country that could really do the job. So I think that we've got a generation coming up, and soon it will be over 50% of the country that wants us to stay to the Western Hemisphere, and in which case things might get messy in other parts of the world if there are conflicts that don't involve U.S. interests. Moving on to the New York Times. The opioid crisis never ended. This is an article about how children have inherited the nation's plague of addiction and how opioids destroyed Appalachia at the profit of the pharmaceutical companies. All that is true. But to be honest, Washington's policy fixes made things worse, not better. My thoughts on this are that we should have never crack down on the opioid manufacturers. I know that sounds like insane idea and an insane policy, but it was almost better to have the pills being prescribed and have those pill mill clinics turning out pills, because at least then people were getting a safe substance. You know, addicts will be addicts. There will always be addicts. There will never be no drugs because there will be drugs to fill any market. But in the original opioid pandemic, in the original opioid epidemic, those pills came from a pharmaceutical company. People might have overdosed on them. People might have died on them, and they did. But the deaths, the overdoses weren't anywhere near as high as they are with fentanyl because these were pills that were made in a lab. Their strengths were known. You knew that if you were taking a 10 milligram Vicodin, that it was 10 milligrams. Full stop. As a matter of fact, I remember back in the late aughts, early 2010s, at the country club, there was a group that we jokingly referred to as the Chardonnay and Vicodin crowd. It was all of the wealthy housewives who would stop into the country club grill at 5 or 5:30 in the evening and have a big Chardonnay or two and pop a Vicodin. And those people were functioning opioid addicts. But I will say that the thing was that addicts are addicts. We took away the pills. We got rid of the pills and easy access to them. But what filled the void for those addicts was fentanyl and heroin, which is a lot easier to overdose on something that is made in a country far away and then cut and recut multiple times before it hits the streets in America. Not to mention the fact that if you went to a pill mill and got 100 Vicodin and got caught with it, you wouldn't be doing jail time. If you go and get some fentanyl and you're caught with it, or heroin and you're caught with it, you're doing jail time. So all getting rid of these pills being easily available did was increase the number of overdose deaths. The only reason why it stayed relatively close to the same is because of the vast expansion of the availability of Narcan. If it wasn't for that, we'd be seeing overdose deaths 3 times as high now as we did when we had the pills easily available from the pharmaceutical companies. So no one is saying that Purdue family is innocent, but their product was certainly safer than heroin and fentanyl coming from Mexico and South America. It's just one person's opinion. The next part of the opinion is this is the damage that Kennedy has done in less than a year. First thing, I don't think the Kennedy family much likes the fact that it's just referred to as Kennedy rather than the singular Kennedy in terms of Robert Jr. And this is about basically the Department of Health and Human Services is coming perilously close to scrapping the nation's long-standing list of recommended childhood vaccinations. Now, this may sound bad, but proponents of the push to align U.S. recommendations with those of so-called peer nations such as Denmark, Japan, and Germany, all of which recommend far fewer shots than the United States, have billed it as a common sense corrective. But as innumerable doctors and scientists have explained, when it comes to public health, countries with fewer shots on their must-have lists are not actually our peers. Well, that's actually a fib. They are actually our peers. Part of the changes was it changed the recommendation for hepatitis B vaccination from saying that all newborns should have this shot to one that might as well be a shrug emoji. This is from the New York Times, which, by the way, the New York Times, the old gray lady should not be talking in emojis. New mothers who test negative should decide for themselves whether to have the babies vaccinated at birth, but might consider waiting. That's going to be the new advice. I will honestly say my generation didn't get hepatitis B vaccinations until middle school. That's when it was required. It wasn't required at birth. It was required at middle school. That's when the recommendation for the shots was, and I had them. I remember 6th, 7th grade, they called us all into the cafeteria, one big line, and we went through the line, and you walked up, you got your shot, and you walked past, and it worked, and there was no mass die-offs of hepatitis B because my generation waited till middle school for it rather than doing it as newborns. Mr. Kennedy and his supporters have said reportedly that parents should be able to decide for themselves whether to vaccinate their children, but the Trump administration's actions have put the nation on course for a future where even those who want to vaccinate may not be able to get them. Well, that's just a scare tactic. The vaccines will be available, and Congress could easily pass a law that says that insurance companies have to cover vaccines no matter what. Most insurance companies already cover vaccines no matter what. And I'm not anti-vaccine. I traveled the world for business for 15 years. I've had every vaccination under the sun, from yellow fever and to anthrax. I've had the anthrax vaccine because I worked in war zones. Um, and so I've had every single vaccination under the sun. And I've had reactions to some of them, but none of them have killed me. So I'm not anti vaccine. I've taken literally almost every vaccine that's available uh, on this earth by this point in my life, and none of them have killed me. So uh, I'm not anti-vaccine, but I do believe that, with the exception of a few vaccines, it should be left up to the parents. Vaccines that should be required, things like polio and stuff like that. Polio in particular needs to be a required vaccine because we can't have that disease making a comeback. But for every other vaccine, even if you had 8% of parents, which is high, saying no to the vaccinations, you'd still have herd immunity. The only children that might get sick would be the children that aren't vaccinated. So I really don't believe that giving parents that right is a net negative. You know, and the most hysterical thing is that the two places where you find the most anti-vaxxers is on the far right and the far left, which is kind of a hysterical combo. The only parents that I know as a father who are anti-vaccine are either extremely far right or about as comically far left as they come. The far right is all about conspiracy theories, and the far left is all about, filling children's bodies with poison, which is, of course, ridiculous. I had no issue giving my son all of the vaccines, although I did tell my wife that I'd prefer he not continue to get a yearly COVID shot, considering the fact that I don't think it's necessary to give my child a COVID shot every single year, considering the pandemic is over. So, moving on. The next New York Times is the key thorny issue of security guarantees. This is about the Ukraine war. Volodymyr Zelensky has made one thing clear: Ukraine will not lay down its arms without firm guarantees for its post-war security. How the guarantees would work, which countries would provide them, and how long they would last. Ukraine seeks concrete answers to assuage worries about whether its allies would actually enter into a conflict with Russia in Kiev's defense. This is not uncommon, even during the Cold War. Charles de Gaulle, the French president in the 50s and 60s, asked the question of the American nuclear umbrella, would America really be willing to trade New York for Paris? In other words, to use our nuclear arsenal to strike, even if it meant losing New York to save Paris. And that's always the case. But a nuclear umbrella is needed for Kyiv. If they want long-term security, they have to have a nuclear umbrella. And the logic that the Europeans are using, that only America can provide it, is kind of ridiculous. The Europeans have two well-armed nuclear powers. Britain with its continuous at-sea deterrence, with its ballistic missile subs, and France with two parts of the three-part trident, that being air-launched and submarine-launched nuclear weapons. The French also have tactical nuclear weapons, smaller ones that... The French actually have a warning shot doctrine. They will warning shot off a nuke, which is the only country in the world. Most countries in the world are nuclear weapons are to be used if they're used on you, or have a strict no first use policy. That's most nuclear. The French have a warning shot doctrine. If it comes to the idea that a nuclear war might start up soon, the French will actually fire a warning tactical nuke at the enemy, which is quite bold French policy. But either France or England could provide that nuclear umbrella to the U.S. So the logic the Europeans are using, that it has to be America to provide it, is slightly ridiculous. Right now, the current offer is 15 years of essentially de facto Article 5 protection for Ukraine. That is not a bad idea that the U.S. gave the Ukrainians for the peace deal. 15 years is long enough for Ukraine to become a hedgehog. Essentially, 15 years is long enough for Ukraine to rebuild itself and to make sure that any Russian invasion after that would be too painful for Russia to contemplate. In other words, could Russia do it? Yes, but the losses would be far, far too painful for them to take on. But the group is the so-called Coalition of the Willing. A group of about 30 countries have committed to strengthening Ukraine's post-war security by contributing to its air, land, and sea defenses. Some European countries said they'd be willing to deploy forces in Ukraine as part of that effort. You will need that. It shouldn't be Americans because this is Europe's backyard. But you do need what are called tripwire troops, which are troops of a foreign country that go into a country that is vulnerable and build bases near the border so that the bad guy, in this case Russia, which there's no doubt they are the bad guy in this situation, so the bad guy, if they do invade, they have to run over those bases and therefore risk killing servicemen of another country and therefore dragging that other, more powerful country into the war. Those are called tripwire troops, and Ukraine does need them. They need foreign tripwire troops, but the logic the Europeans are using that some of them should be American is ridiculous. Ukraine is in Europe's backyard. It's Europe's problem, and Europe needs to be the one to supply the men. So, Ukraine wants decades, but 15 years of U.S. Article 5 protection is more than generous. So, let's move on to what I believe is our final, and this was the front page of the Sunday Times. After seizing Maduro, Trump says U.S. will quote-unquote run Venezuela. A raid caps off months-long campaign against leaders. Washington. President Trump said on Saturday that the United States had captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and was flying him out of Venezuela, the stunning culmination of a months-long campaign by the Trump administration to oust the authoritarian leader. The United States would, quote-unquote, run the country until a proper transition of power could be arranged, the president said hours later, raising the prospect of an open-ended occupation. There is no occupation. Trump has said that we would put troops on the ground if necessary, but that's highly unlikely. The Venezuelan armed forces have stood down at this point. They are just awaiting the new ruler. Maduro and his wife are in U.S. custody and will face trial. And the vice president, Maduro's vice president, has already fled to Russia. It'll be a U.S. commissioner and the U.S. ambassador in jointly with the Venezuelan military that will run the country for a few weeks until Caracas can be secured and the legislature brought back, because you got to remember Maduro not only lost the last election, he also lost the legislature. He just decided to remove all the legislature's powers and stay in office, even though the entire world said that he lost the election, except for Iran, Cuba, North Korea, and China, and Russia, I believe. Everybody else in the world. And so, no, America did not take this guy out and is going to replace him with some American lackey. He's going to be replaced with Mrs. Machado, who, according to all but 6 countries in the world, was the overwhelming winner of the last presidential election in Venezuela, and whom for that the world just gave the Nobel Peace Prize. So she will be in office with her team in a few weeks, once Caracas can be secured by the Venezuelan military, and perhaps some U.S. Special Forces, if necessary. And then that legislature will inaugurate her, and you will have a functioning government in Venezuela. And Venezuela, I almost guarantee you, is going to immediately kick out all the Cubans, all the Chinese, and all the Russians, which is exactly what we want. The Monroe Doctrine is no foreign powers building shit and causing problems in our hemisphere. And so that's really kind of important, not to mention the fact that we didn't just arrest Maduro because we didn't like him. There was an active arrest warrant out for the last 6 years, renewed by the Biden administration multiple times. No, Nicolas Maduro was not personally selling drugs like he was Pablo Escobar, but he was allowing both terrorists and drug dealers to utilize Venezuelan diplomatic cover by issuing them Venezuelan diplomatic passports and letting them use Venezuelan diplomatic courier pouches that couldn't be searched, as well as planes that couldn't be searched in the Venezuelan service. So he was more of a facilitator of the drug trade than an actual drug kingpin, but that's equally illegal. So I would say that to all the people who are saying, I was driving on the highway today and saw protesters going, "No war for oil." I'd like to know exactly where the war is. This is nothing more than arresting someone who's had an arrest warrant that was put in place by a Republican, renewed multiple times by the Biden administration, and turning over a government which all but 6 countries in the world recognize as illegitimate into the government that was legally elected. Um, Venezuela will be a pro-Western nation again, and they will very, very quickly bounce back. Venezuela sits on the world's largest oil reserves. Right now, they're pumping about 200,000 barrels a day. They used to pump 6 million barrels a day. Once the new government is in, sanctions are released. You will have oil services companies in there rebuilding the refineries, the pipelines, and the pumps. And Venezuela will very, very quickly, by the end of the year, be exporting millions of barrels a day. And those millions of barrels will help rebuild the country. Venezuela will bounce back faster than anything else. Up until Chavez took over, Venezuelans had a higher per capita GDP than any other country in the Western Hemisphere except the United States. And they will well be back there. I have no doubt that Venezuela's golden age is ahead of it now. It had its socialist time. It didn't go well, and it's definitely got a golden age ahead of it, though. And that's about it for today's commentary. Join us next Sunday for editorial commentary. This is our casual one. Usually I'm sitting in my professorly chair giving you policy advice and explaining policy to you, but every Sunday we're going to try to do editorial commentary for the Sunday New York Times and the Sunday New York Post and explain which stories are bullshit and which stories mislead and which stories are actually true. And so please join us next Sunday as well. And I hope that you all have a great night, a great weekend, and look out for the next long-form video as well as our daily shorts hosted by the Golden Retriever Jameson. I hope you're having a great day. Remember to press the like and subscribe button, and there's also a Buy Me a Coffee link, which you can choose to either do coffee or pup cup for Jameson, our Golden Retriever, who gives you the daily news in the shorts. Anyways, have a wonderful day, have a wonderful night, and have a wonderful week. We'll see you next Sunday.